एक नए युग की शुरुआत हुई है।
This is Suchitra Vijayan, and thank you so much for joining us for this week's Dispatches series. 1 year ago, on August 5th, the Indian government revoked Article 370 and 35A of the Indian Constitution, which guaranteed the disputed Muslim majority territory of Jammu and Kashmir semi-autonomous status. Since then, India has stripped Jammu and Kashmir of statehood and entirely divided it into two union territories now directly under Indian control. This act has been called unconstitutional, undemocratic, illegal, and inhumane. After that, the Indian government deployed thousands of additional troops in Kashmir, which is already one of the most militarized regions in the world, and then ordered a complete curfew and then severed telecommunications and internet services for 6 months, resulting in the longest internet shutdown ever imposed by a democratic government. Since then, journalists, activists, citizens, and leaders of all political spectrum have been arrested, and many remain under preventive detention. To discuss this year of siege and what this means, joining us today are Professors Mona Bhan and Ather. Professor Bhan is the Ford Maxwell Professor of South Asia Studies at Syracuse University. She's a cultural anthropologist whose work explores the role of economic and infrastructural development in counterinsurgency operations and people's resistance movements to protracted war and conflict. Professor Ather is an associate professor of anthropology and gender studies in University of Northern Colorado. She's a journalist, poet, scholar, and activist. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us, Suchitra.
Before I start, I kind of want to lay out what is the Article 370 and what are its implications and the revocation implications. I was wondering you could start with Professor Zia and then go on to Professor Bhan.
Thank you, Suchitra. So Article 370 of the Indian Constitution was adopted in 1949. And to tell the audiences who don't know what this is, there is a lot of nuance attached to Article 370. So it's not something that just an article that Kashmiris drew up with India as if there was a consensus behind it. There's a lot of nuance to it, like what it exactly is. So just for the sake of simplicity, we can say that at that moment in 1947, when there were certain client politicians inside Kashmir who were, siding with India at that time, and they wanted to accede to India. But there was not a general consensus behind those client politicians. And by the time 1949 arrives, they draw this treaty sort of with India, and they establish a relationship between India and Kashmir through this Article 370, which grants them semi-autonomy, but at the same time recognizes that there is to be a plebiscite. And the plebiscite at that time had two options. Kashmiri people could either join India or Pakistan, but as we know, there's a huge sentiment and huge majority for independence as well. So what we could simply see this as a relationship that was drawn till the plebiscite was held between Kashmiris and the Indian government.
Professor Bhan, can you talk to us about what is the implications of this revocation, given that not that 370 guaranteed Kashmiris dignity or their complete rights of freedom? Can you talk to us about the implications of this reading down and revocation?
Right. I mean, to build on what Ather just said, one thing I do want to emphasize right at the outset is for many in India, Article 370 almost was the special concession that India had granted to Kashmir. We do need to recognize that it was not a concession. It was essentially, as Ather just mentioned, a status that marked Kashmir's provisionality in the Indian Union and its temporary accession with India. So, and even though, of course, it's kind of existed in its skeletal avatar in Kashmir, because many presidential orders have tried to erode the substance of Article 370 over the years. But the fact that it was still there, even in its symbolic existence, marked this provisionality. That is very critical to understand that Kashmir remained a provisional in a provisional state in relation to India, and awaited the long promised right to self-determination, right? So the implications, of course, so even though it marked this relationship with India, but its very existence, I think, for a lot of Kashmiris was critical because it did not allow the Kashmir issue to be domesticated by India. It remained an international issue. And this is exactly what India is after. And has been after for a long time, but of course, under Modi's government now, it's been revoked. And what the implication is, or what the government is really trying hard to do, is make Kashmir less of an international issue, also impact the nature of the referendum, if it ever happens, through demographic change and re-engineering that we'll, I'm sure, talk about at great length. But this is to recognize also that for Kashmiris, the revocation of Article 370 is a forced annexation of Kashmir into India. And to again sort of go back a little bit in history and to recognize this is not the only time, right, that the forced annexation has actually happened. It was also the very instrument of accession, right, was an annexation document. And at least that's how the Indian government wanted to treat it. Right? And this was an annexation, again, done by a Hindu monarch who had no, democratic presence in Kashmir, who was a dictator, who was a monarch, essentially, and it's sort of ironic to me and quite absurd that annexation that happened or that provisional accession that happened in 1947 under a Hindu monarch then became the grounds for India to claim its secular credentials. Right. So just to kind of reiterate, the implications are manifold. It's a forced annexation. It's actually opening up the floodgates. I don't want to respond right away to everything, but if you want me to, I mean, I can talk about what it's done now in terms of opening the floodgates to a Hindu settler colonial project in the region. Apart from that, of course, there's been tremendous chaos, tremendous repression on the ground since its revocation. And of course, it was done again, in the guise of development, in the guise of bringing prosperity to Kashmiris, under the pretext of integrating Kashmir with the rest of India. But how it's panned out, of course, is for all to see now. After a year, we see that the economy in the region is crippled, right? People are literally, I was told by a very close friend and a journalist that there are people going hungry in Kashmir, which was kind of unheard of in that region. And this is for, international audiences to hear that Kashmir, in fact, was way more prosperous compared to any other region in India because of certain, land rights that Kashmiris enjoyed, land to the tiller, which was passed in the 1940s as a way to redistribute land and resources. So all of that made sure that Kashmiris, compared to the folks in India, actually led a more prosperous and a happier life, where they had access to food, they had access to land, they had access to resources. And all of that now has been, literally people are, they've been divested of these resources, they've been dispossessed of these very critical resources in the aftermath of the abrogation.
A note to all our audiences that we are taking audience questions, and I will be reading out comments as they come in. We already have one from Deepa Sundaram who says, thank you, Ather and Mona, for this important conversation and offering accurate account of the history of Kashmiri occupation and forced annexation. That brings us to the idea of settler colonial state. Last year, soon after the reading down of Article 370, the Indian Consul General in New York, in a private gathering which was recorded, said that India should follow the Israeli example of setting up a settler colonial state. So I was wondering if you could kind of lay out, Professor Zia, what is a settler colonial state and what are the steps that the Indian government has taken in the last year? Of course, the steps, other steps have also taken much before, but if you could kind of lay that out, that would be great.
So, when we think about settler colonial state, it becomes very hard for international audience to think about India as a settler colonial power, because they think India is the biggest democracy in South Asia, and they think about yoga, they think about Gandhi, they think about ahimsa, nonviolence and all of that. But when we kind of look from the Kashmiri vantage and we see what India has existed as for the last 72 years, it becomes a different entity altogether. Although India is kind of this post-colonial entity, the British left, and suddenly this power is emerging, and it probably is a socialist, benevolent good in the region. But that's not the reality for Kashmiris. And the reason, I want to draw attention to the Kashmiri vantage is because for the last 72 years, no one has looked through the Kashmiri lens. The lens has been majorly aggressively Indian. That's what the international audiences have heard. Then also Pakistani lens, but there has never been a Kashmiri lens, so to speak. And the Kashmiri lens is that you already have an annexation that happens in 1947. You have a fleeing monarch who leaves the region and signs up the entire state to India. And that treaty is contested, that is disputed by Kashmiris. He has some client politicians who at that time were considered visionaries as well, but they were very short-sighted. And what they do is, and then also West Kashmir was already, they had won their freedom. And that's a separate story. We might like to take it further. So when this happens, from Kashmiri vantage, what you see is that India already is an aggressive force in the region. India already has shown its aggression inside Kashmir in 1947, stories which have been invisibilized, so stories which were never told to the international audiences. Mostly what you hear about is the Pakistani aggression, but you don't hear the indigenous Kashmiri fight for freedom at that time. In West Kashmir especially. And then also, so when you look from a Kashmiri vantage from the last 72 years, you see India very differently. So then you have a set of client politicians who are drawing up these treaties with India. In 1949, you have the Article 370. Now it looks like a very benign article. For Kashmiris, this article was drawn till the plebiscite happened. Now they'd already been duped once in 1947. They just didn't want to go with India en masse. But it happened. So now they're looking towards this 370 that has been drawn till the plebiscite. Now India looks at it temporarily till integration happens, till full integration happens. But for Kashmiris, that meant the temporariness was, and the law was that till the plebiscite happened. That never happened. So that was a promise made by the United Nations to the Kashmiri people for right to self-determination, and India was behind it. But the fact at that time, but the fact is that India actually used the Article 370 as a Trojan horse. It sent it into Kashmir, and as Mona earlier laid out very well, that suddenly India was passing laws one by one into Kashmir through Article 370. And I must mention that the first elections that were held in Kashmir in 1951, the United Nations calls them out of order. These elections cannot be held in a region that is sub judice. Which is disputed. So those first elections were illicit elections, and India tells very explicitly tells United Nations that this is only for governance. This is not to take over the region or something. The plebiscite will be held. And that's how they actually started the sham elections. And the electoral politics was used to tell the world we are governing this through a democracy. So those are some things that we have to consider. And Article 370 kind of made those things possible inside Kashmir. Now, Kashmiris in every decade are waiting for plebiscite. They in every decade are waiting for the resolution to their dispute. And at the same time, what also happens is they're not sitting quiet. There is a movement for plebiscite happening. There are different movements happening. And slowly, because of Article 370, they get criminalized. And by the time 1975 comes, most of the tall leaders of plebiscite, of independence movement, they have been criminalized, they have been tamed. And because they were threatened, they were governed, they were sort of demonized as well as Kashmiris who are traitors to India and all of that. So by that time, they had kind of domesticated those rebel elements by force and by coercion, by coups and all of that. And also the client politicians that India kept sending, those were homegrown Kashmiris, but they became those people who carried India's water inside Kashmir, these client politicians. So when you look from Kashmiri vantage, there's already those things happening. When we think about settler colonialism, we have the Israeli model in front of us. India is more nuanced in these 72 years, but there's also brazen elements. There is direct military aggression. There is indirect aggression happening as well. So we will talk later about Jammu massacre separately, but you have one of the exoduses happening at that time, and Jammu province becomes demographically, now Hindus are the majority. If the plebiscite hypothetically is applied, that means India will have an influence because now you have a Hindu majority in Jammu. And then in every decade, as Mona's work shows, in every decade you have people fleeing Kashmir because of Indian persecution, one way or the other, and traveling to Azad Kashmir. And then 1989 happens, and since 1989, we have already seen a lot of Kashmiris who are persecuted, human rights violations, who have, by one means or the other, gone to Azad Kashmir, crossed the LOC and settled there. So, it has been happening in different ways. And then when we think about Kashmir's resources, they had already been taken over by India. The waters that Mona works on, they had already been taken over. One of the rallying cries of civil society members who were not explicitly working for independence or Azadi movement, but were working to get their local resources back. One of the things was that they were asking for water projects to be back. And it's very telling that last year when the politicians were detained, these civil society activists who were working to get their resources back, they were also detained. So it's very telling who was detained in last year when the Article 370 was deoperationalized. So when we think about settler colonialism, we kind of have to shift lenses in how it has happened in the last 72 years. India has really, really used the smokescreen of democracy very well, electoral democracy, so to speak, because there's never been any form of true democracy inside Kashmir. The very basis is illicit. And then when we think about settler colonialism after August 5th, now it becomes more brazen because the BJP government, so emboldened by its ruling over both the houses, and then emboldened by the mass support that it has from the Indians, citizens as well. So what happens is that they re-annex Kashmir, they militarily re-annex Kashmir, unilaterally take away the Article 370. Now, Kashmiris didn't have a loyalty to 370 because they wanted to have this relationship with India. It was anyways hollowed out because it was called tunnel. The Indian politicians saw it as a tunnel that would pass these laws into Kashmir. They had said this. This is on record. So Kashmiris knew this, and they knew that they were being duped. Kashmiris are very canny people, but at the same time, they were holding on to this, or they were kind of like thinking of this as something as a protection for their territorial sovereignty. When we think about Kashmir and territorial sovereignty, it really doesn't make sense for international audiences because they don't see Kashmir as a country or their autonomous state, but that's what it was. That's the entity that it was. So they saw Article 370 and its accompanying Article 35A, which granted them the territorial sovereignty, which meant that they had indigenous rights, just like regular citizens inside a country. Now, when you take that away, you open the floodgates to the Indian citizens. Now, that doesn't mean that Indians haven't done business or held properties inside Kashmir, but they had certain limitations over it. And those limitations, whether they were done in the right or wrong manner, but they were there, and those protections were there. So Kashmiris were holding on to it because this was protecting their territorial sovereignty. It was protecting the resources to some extent. Not that India hadn't gotten over all of those protections, but now even the smokescreen of 370. Which was used to kind of get into Kashmir and sort of like and highlight it completely, or quote unquote integrate that India calls it. And 35A was something that was giving them protection so that they could have right to franchise, just like regular citizens, right to property, and all of those things that citizens enjoy. And now that's gone away. And they are completely at the mercy of the Indian government, because now not only has the state been integrated, but the autonomy taken away, but it's been demoted to a union territory, and which means that it's going to be directly governed by the New Delhi government. And at the same time, right now, there are no elected representatives, although I don't believe in elections in Kashmir, but still there are some local people there's a local face, there's no local face to this. And that's what's happening. And I don't want to fold what's exactly unfolding at the moment in this question. Maybe we have another question and then we talk about the changes that India has done in the last 1 year.
Professor Bhan, I kind of want to take the thread from what Ather just said. Your work on the construction of dams, your work that looks at how environment, the occupation of land and environment affects. Can you kind of perhaps lay that out for us in relationship to settler colonial project?
Thanks for that question. Yes, actually, what is interesting to me from what's been happening in particular after the domicile law was passed in April during a pandemic. And I don't know if Ather, I don't think she touched upon the domicile law. Let me quickly tell you what it is. So, under the pretext of this militarized lockdown in Kashmir, several laws have been passed, one of them being the domicile law, which means that a new category of citizens is now being created. And a lot of Kashmiris who might be in Azad Kashmir, who might be in, parts of Kashmir that are across the line of control are no longer eligible to exercise their right of Kashmiri citizenship. While on the other hand, Kashmiri citizenship has been opened to folks Indians who have spent, let's say, 15 years working in the region, to central government employees who might have spent 10 years working in the region, to students who spent 7 years working in the region. So what's happening essentially is a very sort of material transformation, right, of how this land is going to be parceled out to communities, particularly Indians, in the coming years. It's already happening. There's 25,000 domicile certificates, if not more, that have already been issued. There are domicile certificates being issued to Gorkha soldiers, to retired army officials of the Gorkha regiment. So you can imagine it's no longer just this, 58,000 acres of land that were occupied by the military before August 5th, and now it's even more. Recently, a law was passed that would allow the Indian military to occupy land based on its strategic interests without getting a no objection certificate from the government. So it is this sort of a bid to control land, to occupy it, to possess it. That is the foundational impulse behind a settler colonial project. Having said that, and this is how I want to connect it, I haven't forgotten your question, I want to connect it back to my work. I worked in the Bandipora Gurez regions of Kashmir, and what's interesting to me is the Kishanganga Dam, the 330 megawatt project that India is building or has built already on the disputed waters of Kishanganga, which becomes Neelam in Pakistan. it's a deeply disputed project and remains so, even though it's been commissioned now. But for a lot of people living along the line of control, they always saw the project as a way to depopulate the area. So the word depopulation kept coming up in my work long before August 5th happened last year. And every time, this came up, it seemed conspiratorial. It seemed as if, people were just, quote unquote, being paranoid about things. But the fact remains that the worry, the anxiety of being removed from their land, right, has remained very present, right? It's a very old concern. It's an old anxiety among a lot of populations, especially along the line of control, right? So for them to name it a settler colonial project now might come in handy for us as scholars, as academics, as activists who are trying to get a handle on things, who are trying to understand how to frame this sort of deluge, right, of constitutional changes that Kashmir has witnessed in this past year. But most foundationally, for people who've been experiencing this process, the process of settler colonialism, the process of cultural, demographic, linguistic erasure, settler colonialism was long in the making, right? So for me now, the struggle for me in my work right now is to really go back, right, to those stories and to see how they spoke to these emerging concerns that are becoming more ubiquitous across Kashmir now, right? So if you look at settler colonialism as a process to erase, to remove populations, cultural erasure, demographic erasure, economic decimation, if you will, and the resettlement of populations from elsewhere into those regions, then we've been witnessing that process for a long time in Kashmir. And to add to that, by the way, it is against international law, right? And that's also a conversation. I hope the conversation goes in that direction, where we literally not re-embed it within the Indian Constitution, but really see Kashmir's centrality to, the ongoing geopolitics, to the health of the subcontinent more broadly, but also its relevance to international law, its relevance to international institutions of justice and accountability. And that's how we need to both understand Kashmir and try to figure out a solution, of course, in accordance with people's long-standing aspirations for self-determination. So I don't know if that responds to your question about settler colonialism, but I do say, it's as as experts on settler colonialism and scholars of settler colonialism have long argued, it's not an event, it's a structure, which means it's not a one-time thing, it's not a one-off thing. It has both long-term precedents, but also long-term consequences that we need to keep in mind and we need to be very aware of. The other dimension I do want to highlight very briefly is that one thing that the Indian audience in particular, I think, must understand is that we've upheld Kashmir as a symbol of Indian secularism, right, under the Congress. And it's sort of interesting to see how Kashmir yet again becomes the final frontier for Hindutva politics. So at the same time that Kashmir became India's symbol of secularism, it's now become the symbol of Hindutva. So it's terribly unfortunate that every time we think about Kashmir, we think of its dependence on India, right? At least for a lot of Indians, that's how they think of it, that, Kashmir can't survive without India, so on and so forth, whether it's economically or whether it's because of these warring neighbors that surround Kashmir. One thing I do want to make very clear is India has relied for its existential identity on Kashmir, right? Whether it was under the Congress to uphold its secularism or whether it's under the BJP to uphold its Hindutva politics. So what dependence are we talking about here, and whose dependence is something we also need to factor into when we think about India's new moves to resettle Hindu populations in Kashmir. And when I'm talking about Hindu populations, I don't know if this is going to go there. I'm not talking about Kashmir Pandits. I'm talking about Hindus from India, but that's for perhaps a little later.
Before we go, we have a bunch of questions coming from our audience. So I'm going to start putting them to you. For our audience who are coming in, please do keep sending in the questions. So I'm going to just kind of go through the questions now. One of the questions we have is, which books do you recommend to students to know about the actual condition of Kashmir? So pedagogy. So what should those who want to engage with Kashmir read?
There's a syllabus. Maybe you could send the link because there's in the last 15 years there is what you will be reading from, let's say, before 2000s, things that are coming from India. You will actually see that in Kashmir.
I think we've lost Ather. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Suchitra.
Mona, do you want to continue? I think we've kind of lost Ather. So maybe we can talk about the critical studies reading list, and then Ather
I hope she comes back soon. So as Ather just mentioned, there is a CKS syllabus, very comprehensive, at least, updated until I'd say late 2019. There's so much amazing work that's come out in the last, I'd say just in the last week, right? At the anniversary of the abrogation of 370. There's such great stuff and some amazing work done by journalists, by academics. So definitely, I think, plug into those pieces that have come out and have been circulating on social media. But apart from that, Suchitra, if you can share the link to the syllabus, again, we've tried to be very comprehensive in that syllabus, comprehensive to the extent that we do want to foreground critical perspectives on Kashmir. As Ather mentioned earlier, unfortunately, so far, the framework has been, Kashmir has been held hostage to the bilateral politics of India and Pakistan. And, that's something that Kashmir scholars in recent years have tried to amend, is that perspective, that they've tried to foreground Kashmiri perspectives. And this syllabus does, we hope, a good job, I think, of laying it all out. And different kinds of pieces in there. I think the journalism coming out of Kashmir is commendable, as well as the academic work, which is very grounded. Either it's whether it's archival work or ethnographic work, or work in critical geography. I think there's really some wonderful stuff there. So please do check that out. It's a great resource.
Ather, welcome back.
Yeah, sorry, I lost the connection for some reason. So I do want to mention here something, as we kind of as people are interested in trying to look at history and trying to look at Kashmiri vantage, I do want to ask the audience to kind of look at Pakistan, because and Kashmiri's relationship with Pakistan, even if they want or they don't want to accede to Pakistan, but still look at that relationship. Who are they to each other? Because India really, really has gotten away in the last 72 years into making Pakistan the aggressor. But that's not what it looks like to majority of Kashmiris, because they have an affective relationship with Pakistan. There exists cultural ties, religious ties, political ties. The monarch of Kashmir, his what's it called? For lack of a better word, I just forgot the name, the airport. His airport was in Karachi, I think. So, there were ties before these borders, and there is no international border inside Kashmir, but before these lines were drawn. And then suddenly, you're asking these people to abide by certain norms and then calling Pakistanis aggressors and Kabilis. And that's what our work has also tried to undo, to look at that relationship. There is one edited volume. Sorry if it looks like a shameless plug, but Desolation Called Peace is a co-edited volume that came out last year. But what that volume tries to do is, it's memoiristic pieces that Kashmiris speak about themselves and their growing up and their relationship with Pakistan, how they had a connection, a geographical contiguous connection to this to this region. And when the Maharaja was deciding the fate of Kashmir, and he was sitting he was sitting on the decision whether he wants to go with India or wants to go with Pakistan. He wanted to treat it like Switzerland, and that was his attitude too, because he was this playboy who traveled to Europe very often. And he was sitting on the decision, although there was a standstill agreement. India didn't agree to it, to sign it, but then he had a standstill agreement with Pakistan so that the essential supplies kept coming. When we look at our own histories, our grandfathers and whoever, most of them have gone to the universities in what is now Pakistan. So making Pakistan the aggressor has been very successful for India in trying to tell the world that, oh, look at this dispute, this region is being, also selling terrorism to the world. So I think that really, really needs to be looked at when people are looking at this dispute, when they're trying to revisit the history and the smoke screens that have been drawn. And I do want to say that when we say India and Pakistani lens, I think India has been very, very successful in pushing its narrative that Pakistan is the aggressor, and now what Kashmiris are, that they're these terrorists, and that's what they're doing inside Kashmir, that it's not a resistance movement. I think those are things that people should be looking at when they're unpacking this dispute.
I couldn't agree more. I just have an additional note to make there. I completely agree with Ather. I think, this question keeps coming up. It came up the other day in another interview I was a part of, and the question was, is India worried about Kashmir because they want independence, or is independence a better option than an option to side with Pakistan? I think going off of what Ather said, we have to recognize that Pakistan is a legitimate party to this dispute, right? And to criminalize it and to treat it as if it is not might help some sensibilities, some liberal sensibilities, but it's not really what the grand situation is, to the extent that we put the onus to decide what side Kashmiris want to go or what they want to do with their political lives on Kashmiris without granting them the right to self-determination. I think the scholarship has, and this goes back to the question of what should people read and how should they read these things, is to really recognize that there is a great need to emphasize the Kashmiri right to self-determination and leave it to them to decide what sides they want to pick, rather than a priori deciding it for them. Because on the one hand, you might express solidarities for those struggles and yet not recognize the range of options that people might want to pick from, and it might be an option that you don't want, but that doesn't make it illegitimate.
And we have more questions. So given that we have more audience questions coming in, I'm just kind of going to go for that. This is from Faridi, who asks, where do contemporary Kashmiris derive the inspiration from or build alliances beside Palestine? Is there any faith in socialism left?
Where do they derive? I think we have to go on ground and ask the Kashmiris fighting on ground where they derive that. I think for the longest time, Palestinian struggle has been a beacon for Kashmiris. It signals a couple of things, not just because it's a site of, it's also a Muslim site, so to speak, where people have been fighting for the longest time, almost as much as Kashmiris have been for the last 72 years. They're the two oldest disputes on United Nations agenda. They were the first two disputes that were picked up by United Nations after it was formed. So Kashmiris have been looking towards Palestinian struggle as a beacon. You'll see a lot of Save Gaza around Kashmir. And so there are similarities. And it also does, so in my work, I call it affective solidarity that Kashmiris have for Palestinians. And I think Kashmir is the only place, despite all the repression and despite the disproportionate force that lethal force that India imposes on Kashmir every time there is a protest. But every time something happens in Palestine, I think Kashmir is the only place in South Asia where there are protests and people actually die because of what the government does in response, fires at the protesters. I think that happened in 2016 when a young boy, Suhail Shah, was killed because they were protesting the bombings in Gaza. So yes, I do think that kind of inspiration is taken from Palestine. The other thing, I'm not drawing parallels here. There are lots of differences. And the other thing that's very important when you draw what it does for Kashmiris is that it in the last 72 years, India has been very, very successful in invisibilizing Kashmiris as Kashmir as an internal dispute, as a dispute with Pakistan. But, Kashmiris don't have a genuine dispute of their own. It's a law and order situation. But when you invoke Palestine, you're also invoking the United Nations. And for the last 72 years, especially in the last 40 years, India has been very, very successful in sidelining United Nations. Cold War also helped in that. And as a result, what happened was to criminalize Kashmiri resistance. It was very, very easy to criminalize. And post 2001, it has been the easiest to criminalize and make Kashmiri resistance movement into a terrorism issue, or quote unquote what they call Islamic terrorism issue. So Palestine as a beacon of just struggle, which is also recognized inside India, despite their relationship, overt and covert relationship in the last 72 years with Israel, that's a separate issue altogether. So despite that, India knows that Palestine is a just struggle. So when Kashmiris invoke Palestinian struggle, they're doing a couple of things. They're saying that we are also an international issue. We're just like them, not overriding the differences. And then also a beacon of just struggle. Because Kashmiris at the moment, if you look at India, in the Indian narrative, Kashmiris are demonized. Kashmiris are completely seen as these deviant terrorists. Even their young students, whether they are 17-year-old or 70-year-old or 7 years old, or even little infants, they're seen as these terrorists and demons. And that has also happened to Palestinians as well. But it still holds sort of this, it's a beacon, and Kashmiris have used it. And for lack of a better word, not used, but kind of seen themselves through that lens as well, shown their affective solidarity, but at the same time said, hey, we are like them. The struggles are pretty much the same and have been same for the last 72 years. We are fighting these occupations, and we are fighting what was not seen as brazenly settler colonialism till now. So about this struggle, I don't know. Kashmir has one of the earliest workers' movement. If we go to 1846, when the first massacre happened in Kashmir, and these were shawl weavers wanting just basic rights, basic wages. So I think at this moment, Kashmiris look towards different resistances. There are so many resistances. We are, if you see very recently, Stand with Kashmir, an organization, a diasporic organization, it was able to talk to a plethora of different organizations working inside US. So there is a lot of solidarity coming in. I feel that this is Kashmiris, although they have been in resistance for the last 72 years, but they have been so repressed that the resistance has not been the same in every decade. It has been in different ways. It has been literary, it has been intellectual, it has been sometimes complete utter silence, complete lack of, just cosmetic peace that has been imposed on Kashmir in different decades. So I feel like it's evolving. And as there is more solidarity pouring in from people's movements, I feel it is going to kind of take on different inspirations and look like a proper anti-colonial resistance to the rest of the world. Not that it is not, but that the world is going to see it in that essence as well.
We have another follow-up. Mona, if you mind, I'll just add it to it. Maybe you can.
Sure.
This comes from Anukriti Garg, who says, how can folks in India be allies to Kashmir? So maybe that question can also be added to your response, Mona.
Right. I just sort of want to add to, so the previous question was where do people find inspiration? And I really liked what Ather said. Well, let's ask people on the ground. That's the key part here. But apart from that, I think as scholars, we've also been increasingly, of course, plugged into and driven by certain movements happening in the US with Black Lives Matter, for example, right? And these are ongoing efforts, for example, happening in the diaspora, right, by academics and by activists who are trying to forge links with, for example, Native American solidarity movements, Native American environmental, anti-settler colonialism, anti-settler colonial movements, and so on and so forth. And I think we have to recognize, I think it's the zeitgeist of the times is decolonization, right? It is people attempting to, for example, speak against police brutality, speak against military liaisons and alliances between, nation states. And so to the extent that we draw comparisons with Palestine, to the extent that we draw comparisons with Native American sovereignty struggles or with Black Lives Matter folks, it's not to necessarily say that our struggles might exactly be the same, although it is also to recognize that to an extent we are up against similar forces, whether it is, the extensive powers granted to the police and the military. It's the militarization of police. And that struggle, of course, is a struggle for Indians too, which, of course, they recognized, some of them at least, because of the protests until Feb this year, sorry. So the point I'm trying to make is when we draw these comparisons, these parallels, it is not to conflate one struggle with the other. It is to literally see that, to see the similarities insofar as the structures of domination, these matrix of domination, right, that come together, that cohere to produce certain forms of repressive policies, repressive structures. And on the other hand, to also recognize that there might be distinctions that we can perhaps learn from. So it's not an exercise in futility to start thinking through parallels and so on and so forth. The one thing that I find very inspiring that's happening in the diaspora, and I think a lot of young people in the diaspora have taken a lead in that direction, is to recognize and to impress upon the world that Islamophobia is a form of racism. Right, and to recognize that it is in that vein that a lot of these anti-colonial struggles need to take shape and form. And that also sort of responds to the second question that you asked in terms of what Indians can do. I think Indians, of course, I mean, there's with Black Lives Matter movement, with George Floyd's murder here in the U.S., there was so much noise, good noise, and protest happening by Indians, right, against police brutality. But we didn't see any of that against police brutality in the heart of India's, capital, in Delhi. So what kinds of inspirations can Indians too draw from these global decolonial movements for justice and accountability, and then apply those also to their own situation in India as well as in Kashmir? I think that's one thing we need to recognize. The other thing that keeps coming to mind is also this Yale conference that we were at, and there were young Indian students with these placards trying to reclaim their secularism back, trying to reclaim their democracy back, and trying to reclaim rights to citizenship. And I remember this came up during the conference too, that, don't conflate struggles for citizenship with claims of sovereignty that Kashmiris have been engaged in, right? There is no way to conflate the two. There's no way to equate the two. You can stand side by side without poaching on what Kashmiris have been, up against. Or then obfuscating the structures that they have been up against versus the things that you're now also rallying against. Having said that, I think that also leads me to this point about how for Kashmiris, it's not a struggle against the BJP alone. It's a struggle against India's occupation. So when Indians stand together against BJP's, Hindutva policies, and want to then again incorporate Kashmir into their struggle, remember that is a co-optation. Remember, that is not a gesture of solidarity. That's not how it is seen necessarily by people on the ground. Again, these struggles are connected, but Indian struggles against Indian occupation have a way older history compared to how it's usually framed in the Indian context. So I think there are certain key issues here where we need to be very clear-headed about what forms of solidarities can Indians offer, and how not to co-opt Kashmiri struggles, their slogans, for example, without giving them due credit.
Or reduce the Kashmiri struggle to only the human rights issue and divorce self-determination out of it.
Absolutely. most critical.
Quick request to both Mona and Ather. We're already at the 50-minute mark, but we have more questions coming in. Do you both have time to take them and answer them?
Sure.
Yes. So we have Maitri Sampath Kumar, who's a journalist based in New York. Her question is: Western media often covers Palestine because of the relationship with Israel, which is problematic in itself and of itself. What advice do you have to journalists looking to cover Kashmir for Western outlets without centering the West, but also making it relevant for the readers? So we are going back into this territory of who are we telling stories to, what are we telling, and how do we tell it? So what narrative strategies and advice do you have for journalists?
Mona, do you want me to take this?
Either way, I could take it, but do you want to take it first and I can take it then?
So yesterday, I was able to listen to the speech by Setsuko Thurlow, who's one of the Hibakashu leaders, activists who faced the Hiroshima bomb, and she suffered. And I was listening to her speech, and it was giving me chills, the things that she was saying. It's a very grisly manifestation of what humanity can do, or what humans can do to each other, and how animalistic animals are far better. I think they think in a much better fashion. So when I was listening to this, I kept thinking that so first and foremost, it's like, how do we make Kashmir relevant to international audiences? Because appealing to humanity and justice and, having just peace in this region is not enough. And not that we haven't, not that that's not in our toolkit. And we know that there are people who will just subscribe to this struggle because some people are in trouble somewhere. There are people like that. But I think appealing to larger audiences, to especially international media, there has to be some sort of relevance. Kashmir is at a very geostrategic position. I think that's its bane as well. There is China on one side, and we know what China is capable of, looking at the Uyghurs, what it's doing to them at this moment as we speak. And then you have India on the other side, India, which now that the smokescreen is gone, you do see it as a neo-colonial, neo-imperial power. I would also call it imperial rather than neo, because there's nothing new about India. It's just an evolution of what the British rule was there. So then you have Pakistan on the other side, and then you have other issues, not just, and then you actually have the unipolar world in different manifestations in all of these three places. So that in itself, and also that this is a nuclear flashpoint, that the LOC is one of the most militarized in the world. And the LOC, which was ceasefire line in 1947, it's one of the few sites that you can actually see from the space. It's so well lighted because there are skirmishes going all around. There are people dying as we speak. There is COVID pandemic. Of course, Kashmir is already suffering from different, one is the COVID lockdown, but the siege that is inside Kashmir at the moment, there's a humanitarian crisis. There are encounters and brutalities, or military brutality is already ongoing. But at the same time, there are skirmishes and there are outright killings happening on the LOC. Some 3 or 4 weeks back, I think maybe two months back, there were killings that happened. People were dying, a young child died, and COVID pandemic lockdown was on as well. So this is an active flashpoint. And we know that there are deterrents and all of those things that nations are supposed to adhere to. But these two nations, the kind of provocations that are happening, I feel that it's a very, very vulnerable area. And given the environmental disaster that has been happening with the neoliberal policies that India has brazenly put into effect, I feel that we also can connect to the Western model of development. Development is a disaster. That we know. Development is maldevelopment. When we look what's happening to Kashmir, we're talking about a huge environmental disaster that's going to unfold in the next decade or so. You're going to have people who probably will be displaced, not just by a settler colonialism, brazenly people coming in, but also environmental devastation that is happening in the region. So not just going through, one is the nuclear flashpoint, but then the devastation that is already happening through all of these neoliberal policies that India is bringing in with its new domicile laws and new things that it's putting in place. So that also should wake up the international community. That this place was seen as the Switzerland of Asia. Now it's just a soup bowl where there is a flood at every instance when there are little rains. And that is due to the kind of exploitation that is happening inside. And that is because this is a heavily militarized zone, and you have put too many people. There are 8 million people in the region, plus 700,000, plus some more Indian troops. The glaciers are already gone. And they're going. And then there is also pilgrimage tourism that India is pumping from several thousand. Now you have several lakhs people visiting these huge glaciers. I don't want to go into the topology and all of those geographical things, but sending lakhs of people to a glacier in Himalayas is a disaster in itself. And these are unfolding because India is opening all of these wounds. So what we are seeing, this is going to be a big environmental disaster. This is going to be a big settler colonialism problem. This is you're dispossessing a lot of people. Where you're going to put them? So this is an immense crisis. So you have everything happening in Kashmir, from nuclear to the basic environmental disasters. So what's not for the international community to pick on and run with? This is a solidarity for the international world waiting to happen. So that's what I would advocate for, that pay attention to Kashmir.
I completely agree there. I think to sort of sum it all up, I'd say center Kashmiri perspectives in your articles. I think that's the least you can do. And just cite an example to illustrate what I mean by this, and also piggybacking on some of the points that Ather has already raised insofar as China is concerned, right? So Israel is to Israel is to Palestine, that China is to India. Although, again, don't take it to heart. I mean, the exact analogy, of course, does not work because China and the US are not friends. But the interesting thing here is to recognize that Kashmir has the opportunity to be spotlighted because of the ongoing crisis on the line of actual control between China and India, and because of US's rivalry with China, and because of how worried and anxious US is about Chinese interests. I think this is a really good opportunity to see the China-India standoff not as a border infrastructural war, which is how most media internationally has covered it, but centrally about Kashmir, which it is. So if you look at local commentators and local academics, Siddiq Wahid's work comes to mind. You should definitely read his article in The Wire to get a sense of why the Ladakh crisis or the Chinese-Indian standoff is so much foundationally about Kashmir, and how Kashmir gets completely erased when you see this international coverage on the India-China standoff. Of course, that's what India wanted always, again, to erase the Kashmir issue from this ongoing standoff. I was just reading these articles by majors and colonels of the Indian Army who don't even once mention Kashmir as a probable reason for the ongoing standoff along the line of actual control. So please center Kashmiri voices. Please recognize that Kashmir is a global player as much as it has implications for people who are living there, right? It's a humanitarian crisis, but it's also a global crisis with ramifications that Ather mentioned are global in scope. That includes the environmental crisis. That includes, for example, this also goes back to the earlier question of what can India do? Maybe India can do a project, something along the lines of what Brown University did last year, the Cost of War project, right? And so and I found that 1.5 billion tons of carbon have been injected into the atmosphere by the US military alone in the last decade, right? So maybe if we were to analyze the military footprint, right, in Kashmir and the cost of occupation more broadly, that's a way to really undo this myth that Kashmir is integral, right, to India's existence. I mean, as I said, it's both a drain insofar as the cost of occupation is concerned, but at the same time, Kashmir is also what has been shriveled, right? Its resources taken away. It's been shriveled to its status right now because of the siphoning of resources and the stealing of resources that India has been engaged in for the longest time. So please center Kashmiri voices. I think that's the least we can do.
So we have a question from Deepa Sundaram that kind of touches on China, but she says, could you make, I'm curious if you could say more about China's role in Kashmir and how they have impacted the movement for Kashmiri independence and governance in the region. So this is a little the other question, like what happens when China comes in, and does China impact the movement for Kashmiri independence?
Ather, do you want? I can give it.
Yeah, it's a very short answer. I don't think it has that much impact. Like, there's no ideological impact that China has on Kashmiri independence movement or its movement to accede to, because there are a couple of movements inside Kashmir. One is independence movement, and then there is also a movement for accession to Pakistan. So I don't think China is an ideological influence, but what we have to understand is that it's a party to the dispute, because the region in Ladakh, so there is a no man's land, so to speak. When we say no man's land, that is under Chinese control, and the line that is drawn between Kashmir and that part is the line of actual control. That was the name that has been given to it after the whatever the treaty between India and China, not Kashmiris and China. So that's line of actual control. To a lot of people, it seems like just a no man's land, but it's basically, as Mona was talking about, its infrastructure, its resources. And Kashmir is a huge, it's a treasure house of resources. It's a treasure house of water resources. It's a treasure house. It's a good piece of real estate. And what's not to love? And China also wants resources. So when Article 370 was revoked, the autonomy was revoked, China, being party to the dispute, was also provoked into action. So they actually entered the line of actual control. I think that's what the international audiences need to understand, that China was invoked to do that, because once India says there is no Article 370, they are also kind of abiding by that, because LAC is part of that big truce between the three powers in the region. So now you don't have 370, and you don't have the guiding principles, basically, whatever was guiding these three nations, not Kashmiris per se. So you bring China in, but ideologically, I don't think China has been kind of like any sort of ideological inspiration, for good or worse. But at the same time, it is party to the dispute, and it has been invoked at the moment. And I do think that they are seeing this till the finish, because as we speak, yesterday, United Nations Security Council again informally picked up Kashmir issue. So we have seen internationalization, and this internationalization is happening because China is interested, even though last time when they met at the UN, again, an informal discussion, Chinese representative, he did not make any statement, but he was in the meeting. So we know that they are worried about this region, and it's not a good thing to worry China. And
but it's also because, Amit Shah has, after the revocation, made a clear gesture to invade Aksai Chin.
Mm-hmm. And also the other side, the free Kashmir.
Azad Kashmir, of course, right, that's there. But it also was, and it was ironic, right, because he made that claim to conquer or to reclaim Aksai Chin, which is under Chinese control since 1962, right, since the Indochina War. And there's this other part, right, Shaksgam Valley, that was gifted by Pakistan to China right after the war. So there are parts of Kashmir under Chinese control. And the other thing you have to also recognize, insofar as Chinese interests are concerned, India's occupation of the Siachen Glacier, for example, right, is to cut off this direct link between Pakistan and China, right? So in some ways, there are these very real material territorial interests that are very key to Chinese sovereignty and territoriality in that region. So to recognize that there are these material territorial interests, but also to then recognize right now for Kashmiris, the only role that China can play, and an important one at that, is become this global player that can somehow shift the status quo in this region, right? And I mean, Kashmiris recognize, of course, the Chinese history of human rights abuses against their own Muslim populations. It's not as if they're not aware of that. But at this point where India has become, or is trying, or has attempted to become such a hegemonic presence in that region, to have China then play the role of the disciplinarian is actually a welcome move, and is something that Kashmiris are siding with for good reason.
I really won't say Kashmiris are siding with. I don't think there is any sides anyone is taking.
No,
They're kind of watching it. They're kind of watching it with the glee of making memes and all of that. Because I think at this present moment, there's also a rising recognition for the Uyghur movement inside Kashmir. Yeah. And Uyghurs have lived in Kashmir for the last 72 years, a section of refugees fleeing. So I think there's a, I mean, I
take the side word back, but what I meant was it's seen as a welcome move because it is destabilizing the status quo. It's questioning this hegemon that India has become.
Yeah, it's seen as like, you mess with 370, which we were not with anyways, but it was your Trojan, but we still had 335A that was protecting our territoriality. Now you messed with that, go and Chinese.
And to completely, and deeper to that question, I mean, you also, as you know, and as others in the audience might of course know, Indian response to the quote-unquote Chinese aggression on the LAC has been anything but aggressive, right? Anything but in the nature of Balakot, the Balakot surgical strikes. There's been none of that sort of pomposity coming from the
Mona, you forget the great move. They banned TikTok. They took over the lifeline. I mean, that nothing can be more surgical.
And the US followed suit, apparently.
Okay, I'm reminded of something here that I think is very important. I don't know if you want me to make a comment here, an observation.
Yeah, go on, Ather. Yeah.
So, there was this video that went viral some years back. It was an Indian army man inside Kashmir. He was reciting this poem. It's called the Veer Ras poem, which are these very jingoistic, patriotic poems. And most of these, if you kind of watch that, if you're looking at that genre and listening to them, most of them talk about enemies of India, and most of the times the enemies are Pakistan and also Kashmiris. So there's one poem that this army man recites, and he's not only stopping, he's kind of like, India is conquering, and it's going to this astro-archaeological, mythical kind of imagination of going up to Afghanistan. So I think that's what the international audiences and people who are looking towards South Asia and studying this region need to know, that their plans are really big, and BJP has really brought it to fruition at the moment, because it's seeing Kashmir sans Kashmiri Muslims. It's actually talking about 50,000 temples inside Kashmir that have been decimated at some point in time, and Kashmiri Pandits themselves are countering from inside Kashmir, like there were never that many temples inside here. But it's kind of like seeing Kashmir as this mythical land, and not just a myth, but a corridor to Azad Kashmir and then maybe Afghanistan. So why I invoked this poem was that this person actually talks about all of those regions and how they will go and conquer those regions. And it's a very, very misogynistic, patriarchal, jingoistic poem ever. But that kind of leads us to that imaginary. And I think Amit Shah, the Home Minister of India, BJP has really been, for lack of a better word, more honest than what Congress and secular parties in India have been, especially in Kashmir. They are talking about these issues. They're talking about, they're talking about the Hindutva agenda inside Kashmir more brazenly. So I feel like we have to start paying attention to the fact that India probably has more imperial designs in the region, and they go beyond this, what we're seeing at the moment. And this provocations with China are part of that as well.
We're already past the 1 hour mark, so I kind of really want to move to that one important segment of the conversation I wanted to start. Um, this is about how does one hold hegemonic imperial powers accountable? How does one hold India accountable, not only for the repression in Kashmir, but what are the steps? What are the next steps? Because we've seen over 70 years of repression, we've seen what's happened in the last year. What are the next steps? I know that Mona talks about demilitarization and steps and strategies. I would really love to kind of hear from both of you in terms of accountability, but also next steps as a way to kind of wrap up this segment.
So, I mean, a couple of things, right? There's, of course, the civil society in India that has, it's scarce, it's not as sustained, but it has been there. There's solidarity coming from many different segments of the civil society in India but it just needs to amp up. At the same time, I say this recognizing how much repression there is now on activists and people speaking for Kashmir and speaking for other struggles, whether they're environmental struggles, Dalit, Adivasi struggles, and so on and so forth. It is what's also interesting, though, and this didn't come up at all during our conversation, is the impact on Ladakh, for example, of the revocation, the impact on Jammu of the revocation, the impact on Kashmiri Pandits of the revocation. I think it's increasingly becoming clear, especially after the domicile laws were passed. Even people in these regions who were initially celebrating, right, the abrogation now recognize that this might actually be the deepest onslaught, right? Deepest onslaught, of course, of settled populations, but also an assault on their very existence, on their identities. So I'm hoping there is some sort of a local kind of resistance to the BJP's existence, but that is at a very minute scale. I think one thing we do have to recognize is that domestic institutions, judicial institutions in particular, have failed Kashmiris. And it's not a new thing. It's been happening for the last 70 years now, where the Indian judiciary it's literally played it's a very important part in reinforcing and cementing the Indian occupation rather than contesting it. So to hope that, I'm reminded of Sam Zarifi's point last year after the abrogation, where he said that he was looking to the Supreme Court of India to step in and figure out a way out of this morass. But of course, we know that there are petitions pending with the Supreme Court. There's no habeas corpus appeals for Kashmiris now. Nurani calls it the habeas carcass now, right? It's been reduced to the status of a carcass. So the question then is very important, because it is clear that there is no resolution to the Kashmir issue from within the ambit of the Indian judiciary or the constitution. So then the question for the activists and academics and human rights workers in Kashmir, most importantly, becomes, where do they take the struggle, right? Now, it's already, of course, with the UN. And I know there's a lot of angst against the role that the UN has played, or the non-role that the UN has played so far. But I think one thing we do have to recognize when the human rights instruments are mobilized at the international forum, they're not just human rights. For example, 2018, when the Human Rights Report came out from the United Nations, High Commissioner of Human Rights, the report came out. It stood for the Kashmiri right to self-determination very clearly. So it did not make a distinction, right, between human rights and the right to self-determination, because it recognized that a right to self-determination was fundamentally a human right that Kashmiris should have the right to exercise. So the question then becomes, how do we mobilize these international bodies, international statutes, international special procedures to make a case for Kashmir's right to self-determination? And, this is something that human rights workers in Kashmir can tell you. The UN is what you make the UN to be, right? The UN is not this ossified, static, passive entity. You have to engage with the UN consistently to force it into action. And I think that's up to us, up to people in India, for example, to rally the UN, right? To take Kashmir out of this domestic politics, domestic cycle of very toxic politics, and find a resolution through international law, through international institutions of justice and accountability. That's at least where I see the shift coming. Of course, the other shift that could potentially come, and this is something I have been thinking of for a while now, is where the environment itself, climate change itself becomes a political actor and really destabilizes the region enough to then force some form of a solution that we hope will go, in the interest of Kashmiris. So yeah, in short, in a nutshell, I think there's no hope Kashmiris have in these domestic legal institutions. So the answer then is these international spaces that can be opened up, that can be engaged with more forcefully. And I think Indians also need to recognize the responsibility to Kashmiris in these international spaces through these instruments of justice and accountability.
Ather?
Mm-hmm. Adding to the same question?
Yes, I really want us to, for me, the question is always the next steps, because I think the kind of remarkable scholarship that has come from Kashmir, and anyone interested in learning from it can learn from the history, the process. But now that we have this remarkable pedagogy, what next? Because this repression is already on. It's been a year. I can't believe it's been a year. Mm-hmm. And what do we do next? How do we collectively think about strategies? How do we educate? How do we agitate? But also, how do we organize? So for me, the next steps, I would really love to hear what you're thinking about all of this, and where do we go from here?
So in the last 1 decade, there is a slogan that has been congealing. It is demilitarize, decolonize, demilitarize, demand the right to self-determination. I feel like when we take this as a broad rubric, then it kind of like, if you look at it like a flowchart, there's a broad rubric that we have. And then we look at how do we plug these different categories, and who do we plug in these different categories. And Mona has laid out some of the frameworks that UN, it might be the behemoth, the bureaucratic body that people see as is not effective anymore, but as she said, it is what you make of it. Because India has been so successful in making Kashmir as an internal dispute, and because Kashmir is an administered body within India, Kashmiris have to approach the Indian Supreme Court. They have to go to the High Court for their own redressal of abuses and all of that. But as Mona said, Kashmiris, for the lack of a better word, have faced legal terrorism through these courts and through these institutions for the last 72 years. Their very basic right to political freedom expression has been criminalized. And that's what we see at the moment, that everyone inside Kashmir who was detained, and there were mass detentions that happened in the last 1 year, most of those people have signed bonds that they're not going to speak. So what do you do with that kind of a situation? How do you give solidarity to the people who are right now incarcerated within their homes, whether that looks like an incarceration or not? And BJP is talking, the government is talking about development. So you have a lot of smoke screens to kind of pierce through. So how do you give solidarity, and what kind of solidarity do you give these people? So when we think about demilitarization, I feel like UN is an institution that can be mobilized. And there are institutions that really work and that can be pushed. And it has been pushed in 2016 and last year too. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, they brought out the report again, and they do mention right to self-determination. I feel like we are trying to reinvent the wheel here. There is already a solution. There are already resolutions in place that this is a disputed region. Decolonize the region, demilitarize the region, ask the people what they want. So the logic of partition was you either went with Pakistan, you either went with India. Have the third option of independence, have the third option of independence and ask Kashmiris what they want. And then we can kind of see, that there are mechanisms in place for decolonization, demilitarization, and putting the right to self-determination into place. And for that, we have to, this is an information war happening at the moment. And I think that's what we contribute to. We are trying to inform people that this is a genuine resistance, this is a genuine struggle of people. And here are the different things that you can do. One is get in touch with Kashmiri history, read Kashmiris, read what they're writing, read their journalism, read their media. There's a new media policy in place, and it's not a policy, it's a gag. They cannot speak freely. Journalists can be unpaneled by bureaucrats. They can be accredited by them. The revenue, the advertisements, which is a major source of funding for newspapers, will come from them depending on compliance. They have to show the government of India in positive light. So right now, the Kashmiri media is really, really working against all of these forces, but they're still trying to give the world a proper snapshot of what's happening inside. So I feel like a duty of the international audience, which is interested in this region, the first step to solidarity is get your facts right. Know Kashmir, know what Kashmir history is, know what Kashmiris are speaking. So twice, I think, in the last 1 year, 2 international delegations, European MPs and all of that were they were actually curated by the Indian government, taken into Kashmir and shown the new Kashmir, that Kashmiris are normal, everything is happening okay. Kashmiris are on board with the changes. But there was a curfew going on, and that was also covered by the international media. I think it's time that the international audiences, they kind of start looking through the smoke screen, what India is trying to invisibilize by having all of these machinations and engineerings that it is doing to tell people that this is about development. I think it's time to question this strawman argument of development and really see for what it is, neoliberal occupational maldevelopment. And I think that's how we learn solidarity. First, get our facts right, and then put everything that we have, put our weight behind decolonization, demilitarization, and demanding the right to self-determination for these people.
Mona and Ather, thank you so much. We are about 30 minutes off when we started. I know that we weren't able to cover the Jammu massacre, but hopefully you and Mona will both come back again so we could have more conversations. Thank you so much for joining us. And Ather, you want something to say? You want to finish something?
I just wanted to, if people just Google demographic terrorism and kind of like follow that route, they will see that even before settler colonialism was invoked in this explicit manner, Kashmiri scholars have been talking about demographic terrorism, and Jammu massacre is a part of that.
And we will have more links that includes the critical work that the Critical Kashmir Studies has put out. There are, of course, books that both Mona and Ather have written. This is something that I say all the time, is that the first time I went to Grace, I had Mona's book in hand. And the person giving me permission simply looked at me and said, why are all of these women interested in going to Grace to find out
about... That's what he called us girls.
Yeah, he called us girls. Again, by this time, Mona was already a professor. She was an accomplished anthropologist. This was in 2014. And the man actually said, what are you girls doing in Grace? Why do you... And also he referred to Mona as Indian and said, why do you Indian girls going to... Again, lot to unpack there. But again, Mona and Ather, thank you so much for this. We will have the links up. The one thing that we couldn't discuss today, I think would have been an important part of this, was the Jammu massacre, which kind of explains the demographic change. But since we're already out of time, we are going to head out. Thank you again, and do join us next week.
Thank you so much.